Good morning. Welcome everybody to September Southern Alberta ITE webinar. Ideally, we were supposed to meet in person for September. The team has pulled together a great program and found great venues. We booked all reservations and stuff, but given the current condition of COVID, we thought it's better to go back in the webinar mode. As always, your health is a high priority for us. So welcome. We have an exciting topic to talk about, but I do want to start the meeting with a bit of a safety moment. And this is something that I've been hearing a lot and resonating with me. As school starts, you know, most of us are parents with little kids going back to school, and the COVID situation, I don't know if it's changing, if it's improving or deteriorating, it's hard to tell. So just want to say that it's okay to feel anxious, it's okay to feel overwhelmed, it's okay to feel helpless, but just do focus on your mental health and know that you're not alone in this, and talk about it. And once you're comfortable to talk about, your kids will be comfortable to talk about it. So just want to mention that and started with the mental health safety moment. With that, let's dig into the agenda today. A couple quick announcements. Do watch out for an announcement coming for nominations to Executive Council. An email will be sent out by the team today. Also upcoming, we are planning to pull together a speed mentoring event in partnership with the Canadian Association of Civil Engineers or Canadian Society of Civil Engineers. Many of you are great mentors. You have always been all your life, and here's an opportunity to be that again. So if you're interested in taking part of it, do reach out to the team. So we have Tony Churchill today to talk about neighborhood speed limit reduction. This topic has generated a lot of conversation, a lot of debates and discussions on social media at council and also media as well. I'm sure you have tons of curiosity about this and really want to know how to put it all together. Thanks to Tony and his perseverance for over a few years, Tony, pulling this together. So thank you, and we're looking forward to hearing from you. A bit about Tony. He's a senior traffic engineer, currently leader traffic control on parking. Tony obtained civil engineering diploma from SAIT, but also has a bachelor's and master's degree in civil engineering with a focus on road safety. Tony is very active with ITE, TAC and CARSP. He's a fellow of ITE. He's been involved in discussions with lowering speed limits almost 8 years since you pretty much started with the city, Tony, I'm guessing, and recently coordinated the installation of about 5,000 speed limit signs to help support the implementation of this policy. And Tony's here to talk about the rationale behind the reduction to reduce motor vehicle crashes, the history and implementation. Give us a quick status update of where things are. With that, I will hand it over to you, Tony.
Great, thanks, Midori. I can just get confirmation as soon as I share it. Looks good. Okay, so yeah, thanks, Midori, and it's great to have this opportunity to share with you a little bit about the neighborhood speed limit reduction project that we've undertaken. So this is kind of 2 TAC presentations that I'm going to be giving next week jammed together. So apologies in advance if anybody was planning on attending those sessions. This is a bit of a dry run for me, at least going through the slides. I'm probably going to have slightly different talking points when I'm giving my TAC presentation, but I just wanted to, you know, share this, go through this relatively quickly, because I'm sure there will be lots of questions. The kind of 2 main takeaways that I'd like you to have. One is that the speed limit in Calgary is 40 kilometers an hour unless otherwise posted. We know that there's still some people who are unaware of that, and as transportation professionals, I hope that if anybody's asking you, you're able to convey that to them clearly. If there's no posted speed limit, you should count on being 40. At the same time, a lot of our roads, collector roads in particular, we did keep it 50 by posting speed limits on those roads. The other key thing that I was hoping you could take away from this and share is that there's more information about what's happening. So the background, but also what's happening moving forward on the speed limit change on calgary.ca/saferspeed. So that's where you can go to get more information about the background of the whole project, as well as the next steps. So I'll just run through the presentation and hopefully leave lots of time for questions and discussions at the end. I just need to see how to advance it. Okay. So this has been a long-standing issue for council. As part of our initial work on this, requests have been coming through citizens to councillors and city administration. Now we have a good documented history of these types of requests going back to the 1980s in terms of reports that have been requested of administration and returned to council. And we see pretty much continuous citizen concern about the difference between the speed limits and how people behave, and even between speed limits and what people perceive is safe. So there's a lot of people who say, well, okay, the speed limit is 50, but that really doesn't feel right in front of my house. And there have been significant reviews in recent history in the 1990s and 2000s with no change. Some of those included the inner city transportation study, which made recommendations for a 40-kilometer-an-hour speed limit. But throughout a lot of that work, the Traffic Safety Act and its predecessor were highlighted as barriers and road design. And part of that is that the provincial government set the default speed limit, and anywhere where we wanted to deviate from that as a municipality, we would have to post. And if we're building a wide road like you see at the bottom here, if this is what our design standards are telling us we should have, this is obviously an exaggeration. This is a remnant of a much, a different class of road that's now in a neighborhood. But if we have really wide roads that aren't conveying that a lower speed is credible, we're going to have really low compliance. So these were things that were seen as barriers to making the change, and held up as, it's not cost effective for us to do this. It really should be the province to take the lead on changing the default speed limit. But at the same time, as professionals, there is already a lot of understanding about the relationship between collision speed and fatality risk. And there's been a growing body of evidence and scientific knowledge about this relationship. These are generally called Ramberg curves, and they show the cumulative risk of fatality as a function of collision speed. And there's generally a lot of focus on the one at the left, which is for pedestrians or cyclists. And you'll see here where the 30 kilometers an hour is. This is kind of a 10% risk of fatality. And so this is really where that 30 kilometers an hour is a safe speed for vulnerable road users comes from. But those exact same curves, and this is just based on human physiology and like ability to accommodate those impact forces. Those same curves exist for motor vehicle occupants. And so even there inside impact collisions, this is where the 50 kilometers an hour, provides about that same 10% risk of fatality. And so if we can actually reduce the speed of motor vehicles, it's actually good for motor vehicle occupants as well. So this is kind of some of the underlying safety rationale for lower speeds in urban areas where we do have mixes of users, but overcoming some of those legal challenges were problematic historically. More recently, there's a lot of focus on safer speeds. We established the Calgary Safer Mobility Plan in 2013 and have continued working on that. Step Forward came out as our pedestrian strategy in 2016. One of the key recommendations there was actually reducing the speed limits. That was discussed at council, and that recommendation was actually taken out of the report for the reason I discussed previously about it being a provincial responsibility to set speed limits. But then in 2018, the City of Calgary Charter was signed, and in there, we as a municipality were given the ability to change our default speed limit through bylaw. So not long after that, there was a notice of motion that came forward from Councillor Farrell and others, asking that city administration review the opportunity for reducing speeds to improve safety in neighborhoods. So we pulled together a team to look at this, and I think I saw Jonathan Chapman is on the call. He was my colleague from transportation planning, and he and I really worked on this right from the start together, and as well as others. Large team for sure, core team doing the work with weekly meetings, making sure that we're connecting with all the right people, collecting the right data, so that we can put together a good recommendation for council. We had project advisory committee, and we were meeting with them monthly, and they were overseeing and providing guidance for us. So this was really the directors and the general manager of transportation, and then connecting with some externals, including representatives from the Calgary Police Service. And we also engaged a technical advisory committee just to provide some advice and feedback to our core team. And this group was quite broad in terms of community touch points and advocacy in various aspects. And so this was a really valuable group, not only for technical feedback and advice, but also just for some feedback in terms of what should we be watching out for, what are the membership of these groups expressing as concerns or opportunities. So we had quite a few opportunities to be before council to share information with them. The first opportunity was June 26th, 2019. I put the reports here. If you're interested, you can go to the calgary.ca and look up City Council, and you can find all of the meeting minutes for these meetings. So I've included them here in the presentation just in case you want to watch the full proceedings and see all of the supporting documentation. But just as a Coles notes, we developed 3 scenarios for public consultation. And these scenarios covered off the options for how residential roads and collector roads could be considered. And those opportunities were we were asked specifically to look at a reduction on residential roads. So that would either be to 30 or 40. And on collector roads, we were also asked to consider keeping them as they were. And so there the 3 options were 30, 40, and 50. So these are the 3 scenarios that we thought would be a good collection to discuss the relative merits in an engagement with public. And so we put those forward for discussion and got approval to do some more work with these. And then when we came back in October 2019, we had provided extra analysis of the 3 options as well as expected benefits in terms of collision reductions. We presented a detailed engagement plan for how we were going to engage the public and get feedback about their values relative to this change.
Out of office.
One of the main concerns was about houses. Sorry, I think someone's on. Everyone could mute, that would be great. Yeah, one of the main concerns from citizens was how is this going to impact my travel time? And we heard a lot of hyperbole about people saying, "Oh, this is going to add an extra half hour to my commute," those types of things. So we did actually develop a tool for these 3 scenarios to say, okay, how much is your commute actually going to change? So you could enter your origin and your destination, and it would tell you your estimated travel time, distance and travel time as it stands right now, and then what that would look like under these 3 scenarios. And it's really under a couple minutes, pretty much any trip you're looking at in the city. So we took this to council, and there was a lot more debate and questions about getting right into the details about which roads is this on specifically. Are we being too broad in our application? Should we be focusing in trouble spots? Should it be on a community by community basis, whether it's need or desire, those types of things. So definitely a lot more analytical type questions about it. And in the end, we were also asked for 2 more options to be added. So for simplicity, as I mentioned earlier, we had the 3 options that we were planning on consulting the public about. But in the end, we were asked to provide more detailed information on the the do nothing, so keeping everything at 50 kilometers an hour, as well as the 40 kilometers an hour on the residential roads and keeping the majority of collectors at 50. So it was back to the grindstone and do some more work, data collection. And we brought that all back September 30th of 2020. So here we had the detailed analysis of the 5 options, including some benefits and disbenefits or costs. And so we, in the end, out of those, all of that detailed analysis and looking at the constructability and timelines and costs, our recommendation at the time was to go with a 40 kilometer per hour default speed limit, but keeping most collectors posted at 50 kilometers an hour. And a lot of this was based on the data that we collected. We collected an extensive network of speed studies including on residential roadways, which historically we hadn't done. Generally, our data collection focused on collector roadways and higher. And a lot of that was to support other engineering processes like pavement design, traffic signal timing. So we really didn't have much data on our local roads, and where we did, it was generally on a complaint basis, where quite rightly people were identifying that something was unusual. But when we took this objective measure on residential roadways, we found that there were a lot of roadways where people were actually driving fairly consistently with what we would expect for a 40 kilometer an hour speed limit. And similarly, on most collectors, they were generally behaving as we would expect for 50. But there was concern that if we set an arbitrarily low speed limit or something that doesn't seem credible to drivers, that compliance may be poor, and that's where a recommendation was made to actually invest more in doing traffic calming on collectors to make the lower speed limits credible. So along with this, we provided cost estimates for all of the options and implementation education plan outline. But in the end, the whole work was deferred to February for this to be considered as a plebiscite. So rather than councillors making a call on it, they actually wanted to hear from a larger pool of Calgarians, which was a bit frustrating for me and I think the team, because some engagement that we had been planned had been retracted, and some of that funding that we had earmarked for doing public engagement was redirected to other important work that the city has to do. But anyhow, so that was the discussion, was to discuss this being a plebiscite issue. And at the end of this council session, as often happens, we had a bit of a surprise, where even though council was deferring the decision on the default speed limit, the item was approved, which was to develop design standards for 40 kilometer an hour collectors and 30 kilometer an hour residentials. So that work started through our update to the design guidelines for subdivision servicing. So our fourth opportunity to be before council was in February 2021. So it's February this year. And administration made a recommendation against having this as a plebiscite issue. Some of the main reasons that we cited, and some of this was based on a survey that we did as well, is that it's a complex issue. It's a very technical issue that affects public safety. And there's also equity and consistency issues in terms of, some people may have a hard time expressing their need for safer roads, and not all people who can vote will, and some people can't vote, so that their voice may not be heard. But at the end of the day, it was really about there's a lot of aspects of this work which is critical public safety work, which isn't understood by the public. Which is very complex, and I think that's well demonstrated by the number of times we had to go back and present information to council on the questions that they were asking. But at the end of the day, we do know that it has the opportunity to reduce harm for citizens. So council accepted that. to not have this as a plebiscite item. So you won't have to vote on this with the civic election, although I think you will have to vote on the fluoridation. But we also got a bit of a surprise because we were expecting that this would be the decision would be deferred until after the new council was in place. But the revised recommendation was to advance with the compressed time frame, which was to have the speed limit, the default speed limit of 40 kilometers an hour, come into effect May 31st, 2021. So that was a bit of a hurry up, like wait and hurry up instead of hurry up and wait type situation. But just kind of a summary of that whole process of sharing information to council and actually getting this approved is that it was a highly political subject, very emotional for people who've lost loved ones or who have been personally impacted by motor vehicle collisions, and also by people who are strongly opposed from a personal freedom point of view about what right do you have to tell me to go slower. Those types of discussions can be very polarizing, and quite often I perceived, and through surveys we're starting to confirm this, is that generally in those initial discussions we were just hearing from the vocal minorities. So we were hearing from the 10% that are opposed and the 10% that are supportive. And so in the end, councillors are saying, oh, it's, this is really evenly divided. We should let the citizens decide. But that middle group, the 80%, there may be silently slightly more in favor of this type of a change, and they can understand why. In Calgary, we very much had a discussion focused on data and analytics, like show me the numbers, what types of collisions are happening, what are the other contributing factors. Whereas in other municipalities like Edmonton, their discussion was focused a lot more on the principles, like we want to have safe communities, and just kind of agreeing to some of those foundational principles, like this is how we want our system to operate, and so this is the change we need to make. And there wasn't a lot of discussion about what is this going to cost us, what are we going to get out at the end. The pandemics and political cycles was definitely something we had to deal with. There was a lot of adjusting when this information was going to be presented to council, council not wanting to make decisions at certain times for various reasons. So in a kind of a long drawn out decision making process like that, it's interesting to see how it goes, and those surprise changes at council where we were expecting to have another year before we'd be starting work, and then we were asked to complete it in 4 months. But I think it was really important to always keep the conversation focused on improving safety. And now I'll just continue onward to implementation. So onward is the city's motto, by the way. So yeah, it was a 2.25 year process to get it approved from when we first got the notice of motion. And we had anticipated the work would be delayed until after 2021 election. And initially we had asked for a year to complete that work. And we got 4 months. So, okay, we've got 4 months to get this done. So how do we do it? So the big thing was, at the end of the day, we needed to have a 40 kilometer an hour default speed limit through a charter bylaw. So we had to have that bylaw ready to go. And most of the collectors were to remain at 50 kilometers an hour. We had to post the bylaw, so the bylaw had to be written. And we also had to put up cordon signage, which is about 100 signs. So that's every entrance into the city. We would have these signs reminding motorists that the default speed limit in the city is 40. And we also had to have radio advisory of the change. In addition to that, we also had to have all of the signs up on the roads that we wanted to keep at 50 kilometers an hour. Where before we could have those unposted because that was the default speed limit. But anything that we wanted to maintain at 50, we had to post. So that was the vast majority of the signs we put up was actually 50s. And we had to do all of this in a compressed time frame. So we had to look at all of those tasks we were planning on doing over a year or slightly less, and figure out how to get all of that jammed into a matter of months. So it was quick turnaround, quick team formation. Some of the key tasks that we had for the design and install of the signs was to finalize the criteria for 50 kilometers an hour and 40 for the collectors. So this required, just a quick review of all of those comments we had from councillors, check it with the senior administration and notify councillors and make sure we got buy-in from them. Then we had to finalize the map. So we actually had to go community by community and apply those criteria to decide to see where we would be dropping collectors to 40 or where we'd be maintaining them at 50. Then we had to design the sign placement and issue work orders. So where exactly are these signs going to be posted? And then sourcing materials at the start was a bit of a concern. This was above and beyond what we normally do in a year, as well as the manufacture of signs, which is all done in-house at the city. Utility locates was an issue, especially considering that the start of this was being done kind of in spring coming out of winter. But even just managing the schedule of so many locates was going to be a challenge. And we knew that. And so we did use existing infrastructure wherever possible. So existing poles. In many cases, we were using base plates onto sidewalks or other concrete so that we wouldn't have to be excavating. And then we actually had to install all of the signs and we had to document the installs prior to that effective date. So there was a lot of work to get done in a pretty quick time frame. The criteria that we ended up selecting, and these are posted on calgary.ca/saferspeed. Some of the main ones were that the collector roads would be at 50 kilometers an hour where the design does not support 40 kilometers an hour. And some of the main criteria were actually looking at speeds. So where we have speed information, we would use that to help guide our decision. So some of the cutoffs that we established were that if the average speed was less than 45 and the 85th percentile was less than 55, then it would be an opportunity to post that for 40. If it's a short collector or a cul-de-sac, if it doesn't really serve the collector function and if it's low volume, those would all be opportunities to have it at 40. And then urban boulevards were other roads that council specifically identified that could be 40 kilometers an hour. So these are roads like Kensington Road and 10th Street, just as two examples. And for any of the urban boulevards, because they are definitely higher volume roads where people might not expect it to be 40, any of those ones were posted. But the majority of the other collectors where the speed limit was to be 40, the majority of those were not posted. And the only places where we did post them is where a roadway drops from 50 to 40 across an intersection. So you're continuing on the same road, but the speed limit drops down to 40, then we would post the 40. Or if you're turning off of a roadway, which is a higher speed, so you're coming off of a 60 kilometer an hour roadway turning onto a 40, then we would also post the 40. And that's consistent with the practice of how we signed 50s when that was the default speed limit. Yeah, so that's Cole's notes on the criteria. We had to finalize the maps. This is a pretty big task to go community by community based on feedback from the councillors, but also using criteria uniformly, so actually looking at all of the collectors. Once we had done that and reviewed with all of the ward councillors and gone through that process, we posted the final maps on the web to satisfy the requirement for public notice. So this was entirely done before we started posting any signs. So the speed limit maps were finalized before any sign installs started. And at this time, we also set the expectation that that this plan was kind of locked in until after the implementation. And that was really important because on a tight time frame like this, we knew we wouldn't have a lot of time for churn in terms of, can you change this one? Can you change that one? So we needed to have a set plan that we could lock in for the duration of this project, just to get it done. But we did recognize that there would have to be changes and adjustments after the fact. And so we just let people know that was going to be our process. Our speed limit map is available now in a searchable format. So if you go to calgary.ca/saferspeed, you can actually just type in your address or any address, and this app will tell you what the speed limit is there, and you can actually click and go right into the map. So selfishly, this is showing Woodbine, so this is my hood. But you can see where the playground zones are, and those are still in effect. So yeah, still 30 kilometers an hour in those effective hours. And you can see where the 50 kilometer an hour applies on the collectors and the 40s on the residentials. So you can zoom right in, you can pan around on this map. It's quite useful to see where those apply. So if you have any questions, this is good to check. There are some places we're still doing a few cleanup items. I think we've got most of them now, but there were some things where we had remnant signs that were overlooked in our design process. So if you see any of those, let me know. That'd be great. We're continuing to fix those up. In terms of how we did this, we split the city into 3 neighborhood teams. So we had 3 techs working with an engineer in each of these areas. And for the map finalization, we started by making sure that each team had 1 ward that they could start working in, just to get everybody up to speed on how we'd be making the change and make sure everybody's working consistently across the city. And then as quickly as we could, we went through and developed the maps for which collectors are staying at 50 for all of the other wards. And then it was generally 1 tech was working in each ward, and then coordinating just kind of at the boundaries to make sure there's no inconsistencies across wards. We also had a downtown team. So there's obviously different issues in the downtown core we're posting. So we had 1 team that was focusing on that. Similarly, we had a team focusing on the industrial areas, and we had a cordon team. And then we also had an approving engineer team. So this was myself as responsible member and the approving engineers from each of the teams. And we would get together regularly to identify what issues were being identified within the teams in terms of specific issues. We have got this situation, we have a traffic signal. Do we drop the speed before or after the signal? Those types of discussions. And then we were updating a guide that all teams were using, just so that there's common application, consistent application of our practice across the city. The cordon signage, we did have to go through a design and approval process with Alberta Transportation, because definitely some of these cordon signs are on kind of the boundary, but on Alberta Transportation roads, either the Ring Road or QE2, Trans-Canada. And we did also consult with adjacent municipalities. In total, we had 82 locations in the end. As you can see, we had two sizes of signs. So we had a smaller sign, which were used on 80 kilometer an hour and lower speeds. And then we had a larger one for higher speeds. And where we had divided carriageways, we do it as a gateway treatment. So there's a sign on both sides of the carriageway as you're entering the city. We did also consult with Sutina, and as well as Alberta Transportation, and a decision was explicitly made that even though there's a TUC which goes through Sutina land, that all of the cordon signs would be put on City Calgary property in that area. We didn't want there to be a perception that we were putting City of Calgary limit signs in areas that were formerly Sutina land. So kind of around Glenmore and Sutina Trail, you'll see that some signs that may seem in unusual places, but those are actually fairly close to the city boundary. And that's in part to make sure that anybody coming off of the Sutina land is aware of that speed limit. But there's also some locations where you could get onto the Ring Road and maybe only be coming off of the Ring Road at these places. So anyhow, that was kind of the rationale for where we put those up. It's interesting that we did all the sign manufacturing in-house. So the signs were produced in batches as work orders were coming along. And just to speed up the ease of installation in the field, all of the signs were actually pre-mounted on sign brackets. So when the crews went out to the field, all they had to do was basically just strap them onto the poles. So yeah, our sign shop did a great job with manufacturing and install. So yeah, just really impressed with the work that they did. They're constantly working on signs, but being able to fit in an extra 5,000 signs was pretty spectacular in that kind of a time frame. As I mentioned, and a big part of this was actually just the timelines that we had. Wherever possible, we were using existing infrastructure, so existing streetlights or existing aluminum poles and putting pole extensions on. And that was really just to make it easy to install quickly. So we had very few locations with concrete bases. We minimized that. And it did definitely help with the speed of install and being able to meet these tight timelines. And it also helped keep the cost down. So I mean, that's a spin-off benefit. There's some places where we have base plated signs on sidewalks where citizens have quite rightly identified, this is something else to bump into, or if kids are riding their bikes on the sidewalks, it's a hazard. So it's likely that we're going to be going back and relocating some of those onto concrete bases, but this was a good way that we could make the change on the timelines that were set out for us. Our coordinate installations were a little bit more permanent here. We did do a lot more hydrovacing to be able to put in concrete bases. And again, where possible, we did use existing poles, but it was definitely a little bit different than in the city where you could just have, a truck with regular kind of moving traffic control. Here, we did have to have full traffic accommodation and go through the permitting process with Alberta Transportation on their roadways. But in the end, we did get the project done ahead of schedule and under budget. And this is kind of one of those PM triangle things because in terms of the quality, there were still some changes to follow. So we still have a few, we've done the majority of the critical cleanup items. We had a few, just, the rush of the work. We did have a few 40 signs that were installed in playgrounds, just as an example. So, I mean, those kinds of things we fixed up right away. There's still continuing questions that are going to be addressed through the ongoing work of the COM collector framework, which I'll mention in a bit here. But yeah, so we're continuing to make those changes. But in general, we got the project done. Having clear direction right from the start and that tight timeline did help to keep focus on, okay, what are the tasks we need to do to complete this? And having a set plan in terms of these roads are going to be the speed limit right from the start and not waffling on that definitely helped. Being able to have our own crews manufacturing and installing the signs definitely helped. They did encounter some issues with sign bracket supply, but they were able to adapt and do a really good job of accommodating that change. And at the end, just as a recommendation for anybody else who's helping other municipalities with this, it sure does help to have really good staff. And City of Calgary, we're blessed to have really good staff, both on our design side as well as our traffic field operations staff. And this is one of my favorite quotes from one of our kind of debriefs was, "We'll get it done, we always do." And they sure did. So that's my presentation. So I'll open it up for questions. And I just wanted to close just with a thank you to everybody who's worked on this project. It was a massive project over many years. So there was a lot of communication staff, planning staff, all of the technical staff, obviously. So it's a huge effort. And thanks to you as, I guess, my colleagues in transportation professionals for hopefully sharing this information. If people are asking you questions, you can remember that the default speed limit is 40 kilometers an hour unless otherwise posted, and that if they're looking for more detailed information, they can go to calgary.ca/saferspeed.
Thank you, Tony.
Thanks.
Good presentation, and what a wonderful experience. From setting up the guidelines, the policy, to working through implementation, and huge kudos to you.
Thanks.
I see one question in the chat. Maybe I'll start with one.
Sure.
I know this hasn't been an easy project. I'm sure there were frustrations, a lot of stress, especially when projects turn into political debates and It even went to plebiscite, so that explains how much political it was. What got you going, and how did you come across that, that stressful times? And I think that'll be helpful for the folks here who often deal with politically sensitive projects.
Yeah, great question. Definitely the politics at times was definitely frustrating. When we're, as a professional, we can kind of quite clearly see what the answer is, and sometimes it's difficult to advocate when you're working for city administration. But I think for me, just remembering that at the end of the day, as professionals, we have a responsibility to make a better community, a safer community. So I think maybe for me, it was some comfort in looking back at my professional obligations and just keeping that in mind. And to be honest, just my day-to-day conversations with citizens. Quite often when I was working in the safety group, a lot of our conversations would be people who are uncomfortable or who had lost loved ones or been injured themselves. And so that was, that's a pretty good reminder about why we do the work we do.
Thank you, Tony. So the first question, will the new 40 kilometers per hour collectors have pathways or protected bike lanes?
Great question. So we do have a few 40 kilometers an hour that are on roadways where we do have those facilities. And going forward, I think that's one of the big items that's, so I guess I maybe could have focused a little bit more on this, but one other piece of work that's still ongoing is the COM collector framework, which is looking at how we're going to continue making changes on the collector roads that were posted at 50 for now. And so I think that's where we'll look at those types of facilities. So looking at the 5A, so that's the always available for all ages and abilities network for wheeled users. That if we have on-street facilities, those are definitely locations where if we have active users there, that are appropriate to redesign so that 40 is a credible speed.
Okay, thank you. Will follow-up studies be conducted to determine the actual impact on operating speeds and collision stats? Will additional enforcement be required, and has CPS indicated willingness to provide that additional enforcement?
Great, good questions both. So, so on the first one, the evaluation, yes, we are doing an evaluation and a few different aspects. So one, definitely the collisions will be updating. So looking at before, after. That was we did put a lot of work into that in terms of looking at collisions in communities. So even ranking by community, which is going to be useful for identifying the prioritization of how we move forward. So definitely that before after comparison of collisions is going to be important. And definitely the observed speeds, that's going to be a really good leading indicator of the effect of the change. I mentioned that we did quite an extensive collection of data before the change. So we did that in the fall and the spring. And post implementation, we're doing the same. So we're collecting speed data at those same locations this fall and next spring. So we'll be able to see what the observed change in operating speed is on those roads. And there's quite well-known relationships in Nielsen's power model between observed speeds, so average speeds, and the severity of collision outcomes. So that will give us a good estimate, but we'll be following that up and checking that with the collision data. And then one other aspect that we're looking at leading up to the discussion about the plebiscite was the degree of public understanding and support for the change. And we've just repeated that survey. So we're going to have some good information there in terms of perceptions of the change and also support, like if people perceive that their communities are safer, if they feel safer, if they do actually feel that it's impacted their travel time negatively. So we're also looking at some of those subjective measures as well as the objective.
Okay, thank you. Will the study inform, or has it already informed, revision to the roadway design guidelines?
Yeah, great question. So I did mention it, but it was pretty subtle. So I'll just say it again, that even before the decision was made to change our default speed limit, council did approve city administration to develop design guidelines for collector roads to be 40 kilometers an hour and for residential roads to be 30 kilometers an hour. So that work is already underway. There's an update to the design guidelines for subdivision servicing. So those are really our design standards for all of our different road classifications. A lot of that work ties into the Complete Streets Guide, but that's being rejigged right now. So yeah, that's definitely underway. And then the COM collector framework is really going to be about how we prioritize bringing our existing network of collector roads up to that standard so that the lower speeds make sense for people.
Okay, Tony, as a follow-up, is there any correlation you found between the lane widths and the speed of the road?
That's another good question. And at one point, we'd even considered setting up a test track so that we could do some experiments with that. There's a little bit of research on that, and we've done some before-after studies in Calgary, looking at specifically pavement marking. We haven't found a really strong relationship. I believe there is some scientific literature on it, but yeah, definitely. I would say more importantly than the lane width is kind of the perceived space for people. And so if it's just a painted line, that's not going to be as effective as if there's some raised element like a curb. So if we're using physical curb extensions that actually make the roadway feel narrower, that's probably going to be more effective than if you're just using a paint line.
Was there pressure to look at lower speeds? How did you end up at 40? Did you look at
Definitely,
25?
Yeah, there was definitely some core advocates that were pushing for the 30 kilometers an hour, which is internationally kind of recognized as as a safer speed for vulnerable road users. So that was definitely a big part of the push, was changing our default to 30. But a big part of the concern was what the compliance would be. And this ties back to the other question that was asked that I didn't really answer yet about enforcement. And the concern was that if we were asking for that big of a change, but we were already having trouble with compliance, that it might just make matters worse, and there might be a lot of criticism of the change, and it could actually then be a good argument for reverting back to 50. Which then makes it more difficult to do the change in the future. So there was a lot of discussion about 30. There's a lot of advocacy for it. But in the end, there was a lot of concern about making that big of a change so fast. And so that was a lot of the reluctance from council to make that change right away. But longer term, the idea to set the default at 40 and as we're able to redesign collectors to 40, that sets us up that once that change has been made, we could look at changing our default down to 30 as well, and just keep the collectors at 40 and then change the residentials to 30.
And how did you approach the playground zones?
The playground zones, right from the start, we knew we're going to be staying at 30 kilometers an hour during those zone hours. So there was some discussions about, are there some additional costs if we're going to a 30 kilometer an hour default, in terms of now we don't necessarily need the zone hours because it doesn't matter what time of day, it's 30 kilometers an hour. So would we still potentially just keep the speed limit signage, but just decal over the zone hours? So we had some of those types of discussions that would have impacted just the implementation. But yeah, the playground zones were always envisioned to remain in effect, mostly just for the awareness of those areas, but also to maintain that 30 kilometers an hour in whatever option it was.
Okay. Here's a question from Jonathan, and maybe he knows the answer for this too. Has it been tested in court yet? Any tickets issued in a default 40 kilometer per hour zone?
Great question. So, Jonathan, yes, I have found out that the Calgary Police Service has issued tickets on 40-kilometer-an-hour default roadways. So where there is no sign. But so far, none of them have been challenged. And it's interesting because what I've heard from the officers I've spoken with is that when they have stopped people and issued a ticket, the people acknowledge that they know that the speed limit is 40 and that they just weren't paying attention. So I know that they are doing enforcement of the 40 kilometers an hour. Back to the other question, I don't think that they're doing intensified enforcement of the 40, so they're still just using the same practices they had before with doing it on a request basis. But I'm not aware of any challenges in court.
Okay. What was the rationale to maintain collectors at 50K? Is it transit schedule and the travel time or anything else?
Yeah, we did look at so costs for transit and those impacts was one of the things that was explicitly included in the cost benefit analysis. So in terms of the cost benefit number that cranked out at the end, that definitely was an influencing factor. But another big concern for many people was the compliance and just knowing that if anywhere collectors was a location that we already had compliance issues, and that by dropping the speed limit by 10 kilometers an hour, it was unlikely that we were going to see a big change in driver behavior. And so that really increased the risk that that this change would be perceived as unfair or punitive, and more likely that it would be opposed and potentially overthrown or redacted or taken back. So that was that was a big consideration about what makes sense. And so this was really low cost, high compliance first step on the journey. And to be honest, as a professional, it's a little bit frustrating sometimes when we're debating for hours and hours and hours at council about $2.3 million, when that's a drop in the bucket for our transportation network in general. I know that on facilities, we can easily drop that on a facility. So, but yeah, so it was that was the main consideration, is just what makes sense, and then setting us up to make gradual transitions to 40 kilometers an hour on collectors.
Okay, one last question. How does it compare to other provinces or other cities in Canada? And Edmonton followed suit with 40K as well. Were there other cities that you looked at that were far ahead, and what some lessons learned from them?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so there are definitely other municipalities that are working on this. Edmonton was actually ahead of us, so it's funny because we weren't sure if they were going to have theirs come into effect before us. For a long time, they were quite a ways ahead of us in terms of being closer to implementation, but theirs came into effect on August 6th of this year, so we did beat Edmonton. But yeah, other municipalities are looking at this as well. I know Saskatoon took this to their transportation committee of council, and they were quite disheartened because it failed at that committee, so it didn't even go to council. But it is continuing work across the country. I know that Toronto has some areas where they have 40 kilometers an hour, and they're continuing with some of 30, and even doing some pretty good evaluations of those. I know that Montreal has had 40 kilometers an hour as default in many of their boroughs, going back to the 90s, and they're continuing with some as 30s. But that's quite a different, in a lot of those boroughs, it's quite a different road environment where everything is quite a lot narrower, and though those speeds maybe do make a lot more sense. So there's a lot of variability. And there's a lot of smaller municipalities, even in Alberta, that have adopted speed limits in their municipality, but they just and they have good compliance, but they don't have enabling legislation. So it's interesting, but I think the change is happening more and more.
Okay, thank you. I lied about last question. One more question. What happens after this, and how do you want your evaluation, like the before and after, and what are some steps in reporting that to council?
Yeah, so we have a date set for an evaluation report to council in 2023. I think it's Q2 2023. We have to report back with our evaluation. And before that, we have a few cleanup items that we're continuing to work on, and the COM collector framework, so outlining how we're planning on continuing to work on collectors to bring those down to 40. That work is going to be presented to council in Q2 of 2022, so that's next year.
Okay, thank you very much, Tony. I know there are a couple more questions I might have missed, and everybody feel free to reach out to Tony. And thank you again for joining us. I told Tony that you're a crowd puller. In fact, he is. We do have a lot of members attending this session, so thank you very much for the support. In terms of the announcements, we need one more new member on our team. Publicity coordinator position is going to be open come December. So if you're interested, please send out an email, or if you need more information, reach out to anyone on the organization committee here. And with that, have a great evening and great afternoon, and happy September. We'll see you back in October. Bye.